All right, so who's heard about a hybrid? Not the Toyota, but everybody, right, exactly. So let's go through what a hybrid, how do the hybrids kind of interact with each other, and what are the advantages and when you might consider them. So the advantages are that you can get the best of both worlds, really, in some ways, and that you can combine the ability to take on investment in your for-profit company with the ability to take on donations and grants in your nonprofit. So that kind of ties into the access to funding. And you can also take on more activities that are both exempt and non-exempt. Now, there's generally two ways that hybrid organizations can be structured. Obviously, we're talking here about two different entities that exist. Some people talk about benefit corporations that we just talked about as a hybrid. While it's true in that they have a hybrid mission, when we're talking about hybrids, we're talking about two different organizations. And they can be sort of brother and sister in that they are operated mostly independently with some relationship between the two. It can be an agreement between the two. It can be co-founders who operate this, similar programs. Alternatively, it can be a parent subsidiary relationship where, generally speaking, the nonprofit will be the umbrella organization, and it will start and operate a for-profit company underneath it. Now this, as you can imagine, especially when you consider all the rules around the IRS and what they require in exchange for your ability to not pay taxes, this presents a lot of challenges. So there's governance issues. When you're operating two different companies, obviously it's, especially as a early stage company, there are significant challenges in being able to manage and operate two different companies at the same time. Doesn't mean that you can't overcome those. We have clients who operate two different entities at the same time. There are also challenges with sharing resources. So one of the things that Ryan was talking about nonprofits is that you have to do everything for the public good. Everything has to be charitable. Well, if you're sharing resources between a for-profit and a nonprofit, the for-profit company, which is private individuals, private owners, they get some benefit out of that relationship, right? So that creates a conflict of interest. That creates private benefit that you have to navigate very carefully around. So that's why it's important to maintain arm's length space and distance between the two organizations. You'd want to make sure that the board of the nonprofit is operating independently from the for-profit company, and that if there are any transactions between the two, so one common transaction that might come up a lot of times for us is, the nonprofit company will sort of initially put some money into the for-profit company, right? Well, that's giving money to the for-profit company, and it's a private benefit. So in order to actually get that transaction approved, you have to have a part of the board and the nonprofit who's totally independent, knows about the conflict of interest, and clears that conflict, right? Then it can be okay. Similar to that, if you're sharing resources, for example, or if you have a licensing arrangement. So another common example is, a nonprofit company, similar to the one that I was mentioning, has some proprietary software, right? Like they've developed technology. They want to give that to the for-profit company to be able to then use it, commercialize it, and sell it. Well, that's a license, right? And you're giving something of value to the for-profit company. So again, there's a conflict of interest. It has to be cleared, and it has to be approved by disinterested members of the nonprofit board. So there are a lot of challenges that do come up with hybrid organizations legally. And I don't want to say that it's super easy to set up a hybrid organization from the start, especially as a very sort of lean operation with only one or two founders. But they can be navigated, and you just have to be careful about them and have to think about how to do those from the start and how to be very mindful of them.
What I usually tell clients is, the main reason traditionally for forming a business entity of any sort is to get limited liability, so to limit your personal liability for the acts of the business. So the second you start doing things in a public way, that's definitely a good time to do it. But there's other triggers that can happen too. If you have the opportunity to take on investment, that's a time to incorporate. If you have the opportunity to bring in grants, that's the time to incorporate. And generally speaking, like once you're ready to hire people, bring in revenue, like any of those things that are really quote unquote doing business, that's when it's time.
Yeah, I would say like also a lot of people that we work with, like, you know, they may not even make a decision for a very long time, right? Like they're just kind of keeping all their options open, and you know, until they get that first check, whether it's an investment or a grant, they'll kind of play all the fields, right?
Yeah.
It's just really about risk, right? Like if you still have to justify, there could be gray areas where, you know, you can really test the limits of the business judgment rule. But for the most part, directors are probably going to be fine. It's just with the benefit corporation, there's really no question. I mean, it's at least, you know, in terms of whether or not they're able to go out and seek like other purposes.
Organized and operated exclusively means that your assets are permanently dedicated to that exempt purpose. So when you dissolve a nonprofit, you have to give all of the assets of the company to another exempt organization. You cannot take them personally. So to convert from a nonprofit to a for-profit is very, very difficult because it's effectively giving the assets to private.
I think it's, you know, we haven't seen a huge uptick, you know. I think it's still founders are having a hard time finding investors that are very aligned with what they're doing. Or if they are, then the investors are very picky and they say, you know, well, come back to us when, you know, you have a product, you have traction, and you have, you know, product market fit. So I think it's still a challenge. I think if you're really going after, you know, social impact bond, that's really a commitment. That's going to be, you know, for sure the way they're going to go. I would think strongly about, you know, benefit corporations because they have a demonstrated commitment, and that's one of the requirements for those bonds. So I think that those kind of entities make it a little bit easier to go after social impact bonds, but I think they would also make it a little bit more difficult to go after more traditional investors like impact investors. But again, I think it's going to be, for the most part, what I see is smaller angel investors who are really mission aligned and they understand, you know, they're from San Francisco and Silicon Valley and they understand the value of that. Or if there's, you know, a product component to what you're doing, then, you know, a Fortune 500 company who has a venture arm and is interested in sort of making a strategic investment. Those are kind of the more traditional investments that I've seen. But there's also some really cool angel firms that are a little bit more willing to deviate from the regular corporation, both in the East Bay and also in San Francisco. Like Better Ventures, for example, is one that's dedicated almost exclusively to social enterprises and, you know, companies that have a social mission. So I would identify those, but I think it's still kind of a tough thing to overcome for a lot of traditional investors.
Yeah, I would say talk to the folks that you're hoping to get money from. And if you talk to them, they will always say it's never too early to talk to us. Whether that's actually true, it depends. But it is good to like get on their radar early, or find advisors who are familiar with them, or familiar with the space, and talk to them about their experience with it. But there's nothing beats talking to the people that you're going to try to seek help from. You know.
Yeah, and it's similar to social impact bonds like PRIs. Again, they're not very prominent, and they're very difficult to get. But that's another avenue where if you're structured as a benefit corporation, it makes it a little bit easier to get PRIs because you know, part of the legal requirement for them is that the investments that they make have to be related to their own exempt purpose. So by having that mission built into your organization, you make it a little bit of an easier sell.
So you can do that. I can tell you if you approach investors, they're almost always going to want you to be Delaware. And it's easy to convert from an LLC to a corporation, including from a California LLC to a Delaware corporation. But it's difficult to convert from a California corporation to an out-of-state corporation because California doesn't have a statute for it, which is just totally crazy. So what you have to do is you have to set up a separate business and then do a merger between the two businesses. So it just becomes much more extensive of a process. So that's a situation where it's like, maybe just wait to incorporate until you know what direction you want to go, or do Delaware. Yeah, you're going to pay the $800 annual fee to California no matter what. If you're here, then you're going to pay that no matter what.
But Delaware's a better.
And Delaware, like the additional is you'll pay $300 or maybe it's $350 per year to Delaware, and you have to file an annual report there. But their corporate structure is also more flexible.